Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Disappearance of USS Cyclops. Introduction. In March 1918, amid the turbulence of World War I, one of the United States Navy's largest support ships vanished without a trace. The USS Cyclops was a massive naval collier, a coal transport ship, tasked with a routine voyage home. Laden with a heavy cargo and carrying roughly 300 officers, sailors, and passengers, Cyclops sailed into the tropical Atlantic and was never seen again. No distress call was ever received, and no wreckage was found floating in the sea's lanes. The ship simply disappeared as though some gigantic monster of the sea had grabbed her and pulled her beneath the waves, as one contemporary account later described. More than a century later, the fate of the Cyclops remains one of maritime history's most enduring mysteries, often cited as one of the strangest incidents in the so-called Bermuda Triangle. This enigmatic loss stands as the single largest non-combat loss of life in U.S. naval history. The disappearance of Cyclops stunned the nation in 1918. How could a 540-foot steel ship, nearly 20,000 ton when fully loaded, simply vanish on a relatively routine voyage? Over the years, numerous theories have emerged to explain the ship's fate, from structural failure in a sudden storm to enemy attack, to more fanciful ideas involving supernatural forces. Yet, an official naval investigation concluded that many theories have been advanced, but none that satisfactorily accounts for her disappearance. In the absence of answers, the story of USS Cyclops has passed into legend, a haunting tale of the sea that continues to fascinate and perplex. In this episode, we will journey back to 1918 and explore the full story of USS Cyclops. We will delve into the ship's background in the context of the era, follow her final voyage, step by step, and examine the aftermath and search efforts. We will also discuss the various explanations that have been proposed, from the most plausible scientific analyses to the more outlandish speculations. By the end, you should have a comprehensive understanding of everything known and not known about the Cyclops mystery. So get comfortable as we sail back in time and into the story of the ghost ship Cyclops, a tale equal parts tragedy, intrigue, and enduring enigma. Chapter 1. A giant collier of the U.S. Navy. The USS Cyclops was a beast of a ship, a naval collier or coal cargo ship built to fuel the American fleet in the age of coal-fired warships. Launched in May 1910 at William Cramp & Sons shipyard in Philadelphia, Cyclops measured about 540 feet in length with a beam of 65 feet. She could carry up to 12,500 tons of coal in her cavernous hold, enough to replenish a flotilla of battleships or cruisers. Fully loaded, the ship displaced around 19,000 tons and drew nearly 27 feet of water. 2 large steam engines drove twin-screw propellers, giving the Collier a top speed of approximately 15 knots, about 17 miles per hour, in ideal conditions. Operating this Leviathan was labor-intensive. Coal had to be shoveled or craned into bunkers, and then transferred at sea to other vessels, using chutes and buckets. As a result, Cyclops required a crew of over 300 officers and men to keep her running and handle the cargo operations. Named after the one-eyed giant of Greek mythology, Cyclops was the second U.S. Navy vessel to bear that name. She was one of 4 sister ships of the Proteus-class colliers, a group of massive naval freighters built in the 1910s. These included USS Proteus, USS Nereus, and USS Jupiter, all similar in design and size to Cyclops. Interestingly, Jupiter would later be converted into the Navy's first aircraft carrier, USS Langley. The Cyclops and her sisters were born from the Navy's recognition that fuel supply was a strategic necessity. After the Spanish-American War, 1898, and the world cruise of the Great White Fleet, 1907 to 1909, the U.S. Navy knew that reliance on foreign coaling stations was a vulnerability. The answer was a fleet of American colliers that could transport coal anywhere it was needed. Between 1909 and 1913, the Navy commissioned a dozen large colliers, including Cyclops, to support its global operations. These ships were the unsung workhorses of the fleet, ferrying fuel across oceans so that warships, the greyhounds of the sea, could remain on station. When Cyclops was completed in late 1910, coal was still king. Oil-fired propulsion was on the horizon, but most major warships, from dreadnought battleships to destroyers, burned coal in their boilers. The Navy's dependence on coal meant ships like Cyclops were truly indispensable. In service, Cyclops quickly proved her worth. In 1911, not long after commissioning, she steamed across the Atlantic to the Baltic Sea, carrying coal to resupply the U.S. Atlantic Fleet's 2nd Division on maneuvers in European waters. Upon returning to the U.S., Cyclops settled into a steady pattern of operations along the East Coast and the Caribbean. Records from 1911 to 1914 show her shuttling between ports from Newport, Rhode Island, down to Cuban and Jamaican waters, delivering fuel to naval bases and ships on patrol. In early 1914, Cyclops was sent to support American forces during the U.S. occupation of Veracruz, Mexico. This was a tense intervention during the Mexican Revolution. Cyclops' job was straightforward but critical. She lay off the coast of Veracruz and kept American warships supplied with coal as they maintained a blockade and assisted operations ashore. The big collier also aided in humanitarian efforts. U.S. authorities thanked Cyclops for assisting in the evacuation of refugees from the conflict zone. By 1915, Cyclops had earned a positive reputation as a reliable, floating coal mine that could show up wherever needed. She was not a glamorous vessel. basically a gigantic floating warehouse with boilers and smokestacks, but she was absolutely vital to naval logistics in that era. In 1916 and early 1917, as World War I raged in Europe, the United States remained neutral, but began bolstering its military preparedness. Cyclops continued operating out of Norfolk, Virginia, her home port, and made occasional runs to places like Havana and San Juan, ensuring U.S. ships had fuel in the Atlantic and Caribbean. Then, in April 1917, the U.S. entered World War I on the Ally side. Suddenly, Cyclops and her sister Colliers were in even greater demand. On the 1st of May 1917, Cyclops was formally commissioned into full naval service. Previously, she had been part of the Naval Auxiliary Service and assigned to wartime duties. Almost immediately, she joined a convoy crossing the submarine-threatened Atlantic. In June 1917, Cyclops steamed to Saint-Nazaire, France, in a convoy carrying either coal or perhaps other supplies to support U.S. and Allied forces in Europe. Surviving records indicate she reached France safely and returned to the U.S. by July 1917, a testament to her range and the Navy's confidence in sending her through dangerous water. For the latter half of 1917, Cyclops was stationed along the eastern seaboard, from New England to the Chesapeake, performing coastal transport missions. In one instance, she made a voyage to Halifax, Nova Scotia, likely ferrying coal or material to support the American contingent guarding convoys from Canada. But by late 1917, the Navy had a new mission in mind for Cyclops, one that would send her far south, into the equatorial Atlantic. This mission would ultimately be her last. Chapter 2: Service in World War I and the Final Voyage. In January 1918, USS Cyclops was assigned to the Naval Overseas Transportation Service and prepared for an important journey to South America. At that time, Britain and its allies maintained naval patrols in the South Atlantic, protecting shipping lanes and searching for any remaining German commerce raiders. Additionally, the United States had growing industrial needs for war materials. Brazil, which had joined the Allies, was a source of manganese ore, a key ingredient in steel making and munition production. Cyclops was to fulfill a dual role: deliver coal to American and British naval units operating near Brazil, and bring back a load of manganese for the U.S. war industries. On January 8, 1918, Cyclops departed from Norfolk, Virginia, carrying approximately 9,960 tons of coal, nearly a full load, bound for Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. She officially set sail on January 9th after final preparations. This would be a long journey, covering over 4,000 nautical miles to reach Rio. Given the weight of her cargo and her top speed, Cyclops likely cruised at around 10 to 14 knots, meaning the trip would take over 2 weeks. Indeed, on January 28, 1918, Cyclops arrived safely at Rio de Janeiro. The big collier had accomplished the first part of her mission. delivering roughly 10,000 tons of coal to fuel Allied ships in South American waters. Upon arrival in Rio, Cyclops spent about 2 weeks in port, unloading her coal and taking on new cargo and passengers. The world was at war, and Rio de Janeiro was an important hub for Allied naval operations in the South Atlantic. American warships, such as the cruiser USS Worley and others, patrolled those waters. Cyclops not only refueled ships, but also served as a transport for personnel and mail. According to a U.S. consulate report, Cyclops received a batch of sailors and a load of mail from the USS Raleigh while in Brazil. This suggests that some crew from Raleigh perhaps needed passage home or transfer, so they were put aboard Cyclops. Cyclops also took on at least one notable passenger, Alfred Louis Moreau Gottschalk, the United States Consul General in Rio de Janeiro, who needed to return to America. We will hear more about Mr. Gottschalk later, as his presence became a point of controversy. Most significantly, Cyclops loaded an enormous quantity of manganese ore for the return voyage. Sources differ on the exact amount, but it was around 10,800 to 11,000 long tons of ore. Manganese is an extremely dense, heavy mineral, much heavier by volume than coal, and it was urgently required for strengthening steel for weapons and armor. Brazil had rich manganese deposits, and this cargo was deemed valuable enough to fill Cyclops to the brim. In fact, loading records in later investigations suggest Cyclops may have been overloaded when she departed Brazil. The ship's maximum safe carrying capacity was about 8,000 long tons of cargo, but she sailed with nearly 11,000 tons of ore, about 35% beyond her recommended limit. By February 15, 1918, loading in Rio was complete, and Cyclops was ready to head home. On February 16, 1918, USS Cyclops got underway from Rio de Janeiro, beginning her northward voyage back to the United States. The planned route would take her north along the Brazilian coast, with at least one scheduled stop in Salvador, also known as Bahia, Brazil's northeastern port city. Indeed, Cyclops entered the harbor of Salvador on February 20th. There, she paused briefly, likely to top off supplies or land the mail and personnel from Raleigh. It's recorded that on February 18th, a cablegram from Bahia reported Cyclops' stop and transfer of those Raleigh sailors and mail. Salvador was the only stop officially scheduled on her voyage home, besides the final destination of Baltimore, Maryland. After 2 days on February 22, 1918, Cyclops departed Salvador and set a course for Baltimore. According to the operational plan, she would steam directly from Bahia to Baltimore, a journey of approximately 3,800 nautical miles, and was expected to arrive by March 13th. At the time Cyclops left Brazil, some red flags had already appeared. Before departure, the ship's master, Commander George W. Worley, informed port authorities that Cyclops was experiencing engine troubles. Specifically, her starboard engine had a cracked cylinder and was not functioning. This effectively left Cyclops running on a single port engine, which greatly reduced her speed and maneuverability. A U.S. Navy survey board in Rio examined the engine and concurred that it was damaged. The board recommended that Cyclops should return to the United States for repairs, which was exactly what she was doing anyways. But this meant Cyclops would limp home at a slower pace, likely around 10 knots at best. Sailing underpowered and overloaded would make the ship sluggish and potentially vulnerable if she ran into rough weather or needed to evade any threat. Moreover, the ship's draft was a concern. Eyewitnesses noted that Cyclops sat very low in the water upon leaving port, to the point that her load line, the plimsoll line marked on her hull, was submerged. This is a clear indicator of overloading. An overloaded ship has less freeboard, hull above the waterline, which can be dangerous in high seas because waves can more easily inundate the deck and holds. Still, despite these issues, Commander Worley set out on February 22nd with confidence that Cyclops could make it to Baltimore. The war was on, and delivering that manganese was presumably a priority worth some risk. The Navy likely trusted in the ship's robust size and the crew's experience to handle the voyage. Unbeknownst to the Navy, Cyclops would not actually maintain a direct, non-stop voyage. For reasons that remain a bit unclear, the ship deviated from her planned route and made an unscheduled stop in the Caribbean. On March 3, 1918, USS Cyclops entered the harbor of Bridgetown, Barbados, an island port in the British West Indies, and anchored there briefly. This stop was not part of the official itinerary filed in Brazil, so it has been characterized as a short, unscheduled stop. Why did Cyclops pull into Barbados? Later testimony suggests two likely reasons. First, the ship may have needed additional coal due to the single-engine situation. And second, the extreme load may have prompted the captain to reassess the voyage. Commander Worley informed the U.S. consul at Barbados that Cyclops required about 600 tons of coal to continue the journey, despite the fact that by his own admission, he already had sufficient coal on board to reach at least Bermuda. He claimed the coal in his bunkers was of inferior quality, so he wanted to take on better coal to mix with it. This explanation raised some eyebrows, as others reported Cyclops still had plenty of fuel. It's possible Worley was playing it safe, given one engine was down. He might have wanted a full reserve of coal in case the trip took longer or if he had to detour. While at Bridgetown, the Cyclops also restocked provisions, purchasing fresh meat, flour, and vegetables locally. The U.S. consul in Barbados, Charles Ludlow Livingston, personally handled some of these arrangements and later wrote a detailed and rather alarmed report about the ship's visit. Livingston noted that Captain Worley appeared unusually reticent during their interactions, not offering much information about his voyage. The consul gathered from various sources, perhaps the ship's officer or local workers, that Cyclops' waterline was far above the usual depth. In other words, Cyclops was severely overloaded with cargo to the point of concern. The stop at Barbados likely served to allay this somewhat by taking on additional coal and maybe using some of the ore for ballast trimming. They might have tried to stabilize the ship. However, loading more coal also added weight, so it's a bit paradoxical. There is no indication that any manganese ore was offloaded to lighten the ship. All reports suggest she left with her full cargo still on board. Consul Livingston's later telegram to Washington painted a somewhat ominous picture of Cyclops' brief stay. He reported rumors of trouble among the crew, disturbances en route hither, men confined and one executed. This startling claim that possibly a crewman had been put to death for some serious offense was based on hearsay, and no official Navy record confirms it. It might have been a wild shipboard rumor or a misunderstanding. Still, such a rumor hints at tension on the ship. Livingston also mentioned that Cyclops was carrying some prisoners from the fleet in Brazilian waters, one with a life sentence. This suggests a few naval prisoners, perhaps crew from other ships who had committed crimes, were being transported back to the U.S. on Cyclops. If true, it means there were brig prisoners under guard during the voyage, a potential additional source of strain or conflict on board. After taking care of refueling and resupply, Cyclops got underway from Barbados on March 4th, 1918, to resume her voyage home. The ship steamed northwestward into the open Atlantic, leaving the calm, aquamarine waters of the Caribbean behind. At the time of the departure, the weather was fair and the sea conditions normal. In fact, one of the last messages ever received from Cyclops was a simple radio signal stating, "Weather fair, all well." This brief transmission gave no hint of any trouble. It suggested that as of the time they left Barbados, everything on board was under control. The Cyclops was expected to cover the roughly 1,800 nautical miles from Barbados to Baltimore in about 9 to 10 days, given her reduced speed. The crew and passengers looked forward to reaching Baltimore around March 13th. Tragically, Cyclops would never arrive. After March 4th, 1918, no one ever saw or heard from the ship again. Sometimes during the 9-day journey through the Atlantic, Cyclops vanished. Chapter 3. Vanishing Without a Trace. When USS Cyclops failed to appear in Chesapeake Bay by the expected date, initial reactions were cautious. In the midst of war, ships could be delayed by weather, by altered orders, or by the need to avoid enemy threats. For a short time, Navy officials hoped Cyclops was simply running late or had diverted to another port in an emergency. However, days passed with no word. The usual communications that should have been received, for example, routine radio check-ins or a report of sighting by another vessel, were conspicuously absent. The Collier's silence became deeply troubling. The U.S. Navy soon launched a widespread search, dispatching ships to scour the shipping lanes between Barbados and the United States. American and Allied naval vessels crisscrossed the Atlantic along Cyclops' expected route, looking for debris, lifeboats, or any sign of the missing ship. Other ships in the area were queried by radio to find out if any had crossed paths with Cyclops or picked up an SOS. All inquiries met with negative results. The ocean yielded nothing, not a single piece of floating wreckage, no oil slick, no distress signal. It was as if Cyclops had been swallowed by the sea. On March 13th, Cyclops' due date, there was still hope that maybe she had been slowed further or limped into an out-of-the-way harbor. But by the end of March 1918, hope gave way to grim acceptance that something was very wrong. Finally, on April 14, 1918, more than a month after the last sighting of the ship, the U.S. Navy publicly announced that Cyclops was overdue and feared lost. The next day, April 15th, newspapers across the United States ran headline stories about the strange disappearance of the Cyclops, bringing the mystery to the attention of the general public. America was shocked, though wartime censorship often limited bad news. The Cyclops case was so puzzling and significant that it became headline material. Many could not fathom how such a large vessel, crewed by U.S. Navy sailors, could simply vanish on a fairly well-traveled route. The Navy's search efforts intensified after the public announcement. Over the following weeks, U.S. destroyers and patrol craft combed the waters off the U.S. East Coast and down through the Bahamas, while Allied ships in the Caribbean and along South America kept a lookout. They found absolutely nothing. Not a scrap of wreckage could be conclusively linked to Cyclops. As one magazine later noted, usually a wooden bucket or a cork life preserver, identified as belonging to a lost ship, is picked up after a wreck, but not so with the Cyclops. It was as though the ship had vanished suddenly and completely, with no time for anyone to send a wireless call for help or launch a lifeboat. Indeed, no SOS from Cyclops was ever received by any station or ship, a fact which greatly amplified the mystery. Even if a catastrophe struck, why had there been no distress signal? The Cyclops did have a radio system, and there were plenty of other ships and listening posts in range along the part of her route. The silence suggested a very fast disaster, one that incapacitated the ship almost instantly. By late spring 1918, with still no trace of Cyclops, the Navy had to conclude the worst. On June 1st, 1918, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin D. Roosevelt, officially declared USS Cyclops lost with all hands. A subsequent Navy report listed the loss date as presumed the 13th of March 1918 and noted that 293 officers, sailors, and passengers were dead. Some sources put the number on board at 306 or 309. The exact manifest count is a bit unclear due to last-minute additions and transfers, but roughly 300 lives were lost. It was a staggering loss for a single incident, not involving combat. President Woodrow Wilson, in expressing the nation's grief and perplexity, remarked, "Only God and the sea know what happened to the great ship." The phrase captured the sense of mystique and tragedy that surrounded the Cyclops from then on. For the families of those on board, the uncertainty made the loss even more agonizing. Many held on to hope for weeks or months, imagining scenarios in which their loved ones might have survived on rafts or reached a remote island. In the spring and summer of 1918, false rumors occasionally appeared in the press. For instance, unverified reports that Cyclops had been found safe in some port, only to be quickly refuted, dashing the hopes of waiting families. The reality eventually sank in that no miracle rescue was forthcoming. Memorial services were held, and the names of Cyclops officers and crew were added to casualty rolls. The human cost was felt in communities across the country. One particularly heart-wrenching story was that of John P. Beggs of Alabama, whose son Hamilton Beggs was a sailor aboard Cyclops. The grieving father was so overwhelmed that he went to a military recruiter and implored, "I want to know if there is anywhere that you can use me, in a shipbuilding plant, ammunition plant, Army, Navy, or anywhere else." His plea to serve in his last son's stead exemplified the sorrow and desperation felt by families of the missing. Another lost crewman was Lewis H. Hardwick, an African-American mess attendant. Hardwick's young son, Herbert, would grow up without his father and later become a famous boxer in the 1930s, known as the Coco Kid, one of the many personal stories intertwined with the Cyclops tragedy. The disappearance of Cyclops was and remains a baffling puzzle. In 1918, the U.S. Navy convened boards and inquiries to investigate every scrap of evidence they could find related to the ship's last voyage. But with no witnesses and no wreckage, there was pitifully little to go on. Navy investigators reviewed Cyclops' maintenance history, cargo logs, and communications sent from port. They interviewed officers from the ports Cyclops visited and other captains who traversed the same waters around that time. They even checked German naval records after the war, looking for any mention of Cyclops in U-boat logs or intelligence reports. All efforts led nowhere conclusively. The final Navy report on the disaster, issued a couple years later, admitted frankly, the disappearance of this ship has been one of the most baffling mysteries in the annals of the Navy, all attempts to locate her having proved unsuccessful. In the annual report of the Secretary of the Navy for 1918, Cyclops' loss was duly noted, but no cause could be ascribed beyond missing, presumed lost. It was a bitter pill for a Navy that prided itself on knowing the fate of its ships. Public and press speculation, of course, was not so restrained. In newspapers and journals, many theories were floated in the immediate aftermath of the lost. Some wondered if a sudden squall or rogue wave had overwhelmed Cyclops, yet no severe weather was reported on her known route at the time, apart from a storm further north to be discussed later. Others suspected German sabotage or attack, given that America was at war with Germany in 1918. Indeed, the idea that a German U-boat or commerce raider might have sunk Cyclops was a prevalent rumor, which Navy officials had to examine closely. Still others, noting the ship's name and the dramatic circumstances, indulged in more fanciful conjecture. Maybe the Cyclops had fallen victim to a sea monster or some supernatural phenomenon in the Atlantic. Over the years, especially as the legend of the Bermuda Triangle grew, the Cyclops' fate has been cited alongside dozens of other unexplained disappearances of ships and planes in that region, bounded by Bermuda, Florida, and Puerto Rico. The loss of Cyclops is often considered one of the cornerstone mysteries of the Bermuda Triangle lore, though in 1918 no such term existed yet. What made the Cyclops case particularly haunting was the totality of the disappearance. A vessel the length of 2 football fields, crewed by hundreds, simply gone. As a writer for Santa Fe magazine noted a few years later, typically, even after a shipwreck, something will be found. A bit of debris, lifeboat, a message in a bottle. But with Cyclops, nothing at all ever surfaced. That stark absence of evidence has kept the story alive in public memory. For decades, treasure hunters and researchers have occasionally set out to hunt for the remains of Cyclops on the ocean floor, without success. To this day, Cyclops remains the last major U.S. Navy ship unaccounted for. Her wreck has never been located. The ocean holds its secrets well, particularly in the deep and vast stretches where Cyclops likely met her end. Before we explore the theories about what might have happened to Cyclops, it's important to understand more about the people involved, especially her captain, in the context in which the ship was sailing. The circumstances on board Cyclops during that final voyage made whole clues, or at least intriguing subplots, to the overall mystery. In the next section, we'll take a closer look at Lieutenant Commander George Worley, the enigmatic master of Cyclops, as well as the crew and passengers under his charge. Chapter 4: The Man Behind the Mystery. At the center of the Cyclops saga is the ship's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley, a man who, both during his life and after his disappearance, became a figure of intense scrutiny and controversy. In many ways, Captain Worley's own story is nearly as strange as the disappearance of his ship. George Worley was not who he appeared to be. Born as Johann Friedrich Wickmann in 1862 in Hanover, Germany, he spent his early years far from any connection to the U.S. Navy. As a teenager, Wickmann went to sea, and in 1878, he jumped ship in San Francisco, effectively deserting whatever vessel had brought him to America. Like many stowaways and drifters of that era, he decided to start a new life in the New World. He adopted a new name, George Worley, taking the surname of a seaman friend, and sought to establish himself. By the 1890s, Worley was running a saloon on the Barbary coast of San Francisco, a rough and tumble district famous for its sailors' taverns. However, during these years, Worley also acquired legitimate maritime skills. He qualified for a license as a ship's master, likely through working on merchant ships, and by the turn of the century was captaining merchant vessels in the Pacific trade. Some accounts suggest he wasn't always scrupulous about his cargoes. Rumors circulated that he dealt in smuggled opium and other contraband on runs between the Far East and San Francisco. Whatever the truth, by the 1910s, George Worley had built a career as a seasoned mariner, albeit one with an eccentric and hard-edged reputation. When World War I began, the U.S. Navy expanded rapidly and sought experienced seamen to command its growing fleet of auxiliary ships. Despite his background and German birth, Worley was commissioned as a lieutenant commander in the Naval Auxiliary Reserve on February 21, 1917, just as the U.S. was preparing to enter the war. He was given command of the USS Cyclops, which at that time was still operating in a support capacity. One can imagine that his extensive merchant marine experience, including handling large cargo ships, made him a reasonable choice on paper. However, once in command, Lieutenant Commander Worley demonstrated a leadership style that was, to put it mildly, problematic. By all accounts, he was a martinet with a fierce temper. Former crew members later told naval investigators that Worley was prone to raging at his officers and sailors over minor issues, liberally cursing and verbally abusing them. He could be violent as well. One anecdote has him chasing a junior ensign around the deck with a pistol in hand during a fit of anger. Even on calmer days, Worley was odd. He was known to make his rounds about the ship dressed in nothing but long underwear and a derby hat, a quirky choice of attire that left many crewmen scratching their heads. This image of the captain strutting on deck in his undergarments and a bowler could almost be comical, if not for the undercurrent of fear he instilled in his subordinates. Worley's harsh treatment of his crew bred considerable resentment. The officers and men of Cyclops often voiced their dislike of their commander in letters and offhand remarks. Some considered him incompetent as a navigator as well. The Cyclops had a reputation for not being especially well handled, and one theory later raised was that Worley was a very indifferent seaman, an overly cautious navigator who might have blundered into trouble. In late 1917, there were even formal complaints. It came to light that a few months before the final voyage, certain crew members attempted to have Worley removed for drunkenness or unfitness. According to a History Channel investigation, months earlier, some members of the crew claimed Worley was a drunk, unsuitable to steer a ship, and there were reports a minor mutiny had been staged against him. The Navy apparently looked into these allegations, but ultimately defended Worley and kept him in command. perhaps because experienced captains were in short supply during the war. So, as Cyclops set sail for Brazil on January 1918, it did so under a captain who was disliked by many of his crew and possibly distrusted by some of his officers. This underlying tension is an important backdrop to events during the voyage. One key incident that likely impacted Cyclops' fate was an argument between Worley and his executive officer or second in command during the Rio stop. Conrad A. Nervig, who had been a naval reservist serving on Cyclops, later recounted that the ship's executive officer, the one man aboard who really knew how to properly stow and secure a cargo of dense ore, was relieved of duty and confined to quarters in Rio after a clash with Captain Worley. Essentially, Worley had his most experienced cargo officer locked in his cabin, and an inexperienced subordinate was put in charge of supervising the loading of the manganese ore. If this recollection is accurate, it had serious consequences. Nervig believed the ore was improperly loaded as a result, contributing to the ship's instability later. We will revisit Nervig's insights when discussing theories of the ship's sinking, but it highlights how Worley's tyrannical style may have directly affected the safety of the voyage. Besides the crew, Cyclops carried a few passengers, of whom the most noteworthy was Alfred L. M. Gottschalk, the U.S. Consul General in Rio de Janeiro. Gottschalk was an American diplomat, but notably, he was widely criticized for pro-German sympathies. In Brazil, which had a significant German expatriate population, Gottschalk had a reputation for being overly friendly to Germans and was reportedly roundly hated by local Allied circles for it. That he and Worley were together on the same voyage is intriguing. Here, we have a German-born captain and an allegedly pro-German American consul traveling on a U.S. Navy ship during wartime. It is important to clarify that Gottschalk was returning to the U.S. at the Navy's invitation, likely just a routine home leave or reassignment, and there is no evidence he did anything wrong. However, after the disappearance, conspiracy theories sprang up around this coincidence. Some speculated that if anyone were to collude with Germany, it might be this duo. We'll examine that theory later, but suffice it to say that their presence together became a focal point for suspicion. Consul Charles Ludlow Livingston in Barbados, who interacted with Worley during Cyclops' stopover, was alarmed enough by what he saw and heard that he sent a confidential telegram to the State Department on April 1st, 1918, after Cyclops was declared missing, detailing his concerns. In this remarkable dispatch, Livingston reported that other officers referred to Worley as a damned Dutchman, an offensive slang implying German, and that apparently Cyclops officers disliked their captain intensely. He relayed the rumors of a disturbance and possibly even an execution on board during the voyage to Barbados. Livingston also noted that when he looked at the crew lists, many Germanic names appeared among the crew and passenger. This added to his gut feeling that perhaps something more sinister than an accident had occurred, In his words, he feared a fate worse than sinking might have befallen Cyclops, though he admitted he had no proof and that it was an instinctive dislike of the captain coloring his views. The consul even mentioned that numerous telegrams for Worley were delivered to the ship in Barbados, with more help in St. Thomas, raising questions in his mind about what communications Worley was engaged in. All these insinuations were thoroughly investigated later. The Office of Naval Intelligence dug into Worley's background and confirmed his German origins and unusual behavior, but they found no concrete evidence of treachery. German archives after the war showed no record that Cyclops had been taken or that Worley had been in contact with the enemy. The crew of Cyclops, aside from any disloyal individuals, if any existed at all, were mostly regular Navy sailors doing their duty. They ranged from veteran petty officers to fresh young seamen. We catch glimpses of them in records and anecdotes. For example, Gordon Dewey's, a seaman whose photograph later appeared in news stories among the lost, and Jesse W. Gilpatrick, the chief engineer, an important figure given the engine troubles. In comments on a Navy blog a century later, descendants remember names like Jesse Fincher, fireman second class, who was 25 when Cyclops vanished. The diversity of the crew was notable too. Among them were immigrants and African Americans serving in the messman branch, as was common in that era. All told, the souls aboard Cyclops comprised Navy officers, enlisted sailors, 1 or 2 Marine guards, likely watching the prisoners, a handful of civilians or Army passengers, like Consul Gottschalk, and possibly those Navy prisoners in the brig. It was a full ship in terms of human life, around 300 men and women if we included a few civilian technicians or family members, though most accounts say all aboard were men. In sum, the human element aboard Cyclops prior to her disappearance featured a combustible mix of domineering captain, a possibly demoralized crew, and the pressures of wartime service. There were frictions and perhaps mistrust, yet one must be cautious. Despite these dramas, there is no definitive evidence that they directly caused the loss of the ship. They do, however, provide context that might explain certain theories. For example, could a badly loaded cargo or a breakdown in discipline have contributed to the disaster? Could sabotage or mutiny have played a role? These questions naturally arose when people later tried to make sense of the inexplicable. With an understanding of the ship's state, mechanically overloaded and underpowered, and the people aboard, some of them stressed and unhappy, we are now equipped to consider what might have happened. In the following sections, we will explore the major theories that have been proposed for the disappearance of USS Cyclops. Chapter 5. Theories and Explanations. Over the years, researchers, naval officers, and enthusiasts have put forward a number of hypotheses to explain the fate of Cyclops. The U.S. Navy's official stance is that the cause is unknown. Only God and the sea knows, as Wilson said. But that hasn't stopped vigorous debate. We explore the most significant theories from the mundane to the exotic, each offering a possible answer to the riddle of Cyclops' disappearance. Theory 1. Structural failure and sudden sinking. The most widely accepted theory among maritime experts is that Cyclops was lost due to catastrophic structural failure, possibly aggravated by bad weather and improper loading of a very heavy cargo. In essence, this theory posits that Cyclops simply broke apart or capsized and sank almost instantaneously, giving no chance for a distress call or evacuation. There are several key pieces of evidence and reasoning supporting this scenario. Overloading and cargo shift. As noted, Cyclops left Brazil carrying far more weight than she was designed for. Over 10,000 tons of dense manganese ore versus a nominal capacity of 8,000 tons. This alone put tremendous stress on the ship's hull. Conrad Nervig, a Navy sailor who had served on Cyclops until Rio, and who was fortunate to leave the ship there, wrote an article decades later recounting his experience. He firmly believed the ship probably sank due to improper loading of the manganese ore. According to Nervig, the heavy ore was stored mainly amidship in the center holds. Such an uneven weight distribution could overstress the hull girder, the structural spine of the ship, especially if the bow and stern were riding on wave crests with the midsection unsupported in a trough. In rough seas, this could literally cause the hull to sag in the middle and fracture. Nervig pointed out that the one officer truly knowledgeable about loading that unusual cargo, the executive officer, had been confined to quarters by Captain Worley over an argument. In his absence, the ore might not have been properly distributed or secured. If the ore cargo was piled incorrectly, the ship could develop structural weak points or instability. Weakening of ship's metal. Some data emerged after the loss that ships of Cyclops class had potential weaknesses. Rear Admiral George Van Doors later noted that the Proteus class colliers had longitudinal I-beams running along their hull that were prone to corrosion over time. Cyclops and her sisters often carried coal, which sometimes led to coal bunker fires. Slow, smoldering fires were not uncommon in coal piles. There were reports that Cyclops, at one point, had suffered a coal fire or other hull damage prior to 1918. Such events could warp or weaken her structural members. The corrosive nature of certain cargoes also could eat away at the metal. In fact, another ship of similar design, a freighter named Chucky, reportedly snapped in two in calm seas under a heavy load, suggesting that if Cyclops' hull was compromised, a fracture was possible, even without extreme weather. It's a chilling thought. The massive Cyclops might have simply broken apart and gone down in minutes. Rolling instability issues. USS Cyclops had a history of being a bit top-heavy or prone to rolling. It was documented that she had problems with extreme rolls on at least one occasion prior to 1918. A heavy load of ore in her belly could have raised her center of gravity if not balanced with proper ballast. Witnesses say that when Cyclops departed Barbados, she was listing slightly and riding very low, not a stable configuration for high seas. If the ore cargo was not fully settled, or if it got wet, it might have shifted. A Lloyd's of London's expert consulted in 2009 pointed out that manganese ore, being much denser than coal, doesn't fill a hold completely. There would have been space for it to move if not tightly shored. Worse, Cyclops' hatch covers were just canvas tarpaulins, not watertight steel plates. In heavy rain or spray, water could seep into the hold, and dense ore can turn into a slurry when wet. This slurry can suddenly shift from side to side, a phenomenon known as liquefaction of cargo, causing a ship to capsize very quickly. If Cyclops hit rough weather, a shifting cargo could have made her heel tilt strongly, and if she heeled too far, the ship could founder before anyone could react. Weather factors. Officially, the Navy said Cyclops probably sank in an unexpected storm. However, weather records for early March 1918 show generally mild conditions along most of her route. The notable exception was gale on March 10, 1918, in the vicinity of the Virginia Capes, the entrance to Chesapeake Bay. On March 9th, Cyclops was rumored to have been sighted by a molasses tanker, SS Amical, near that area. But Amical's captain later denied seeing her, and the timing would have been odd if Cyclops wasn't due until the 13th. Whether Cyclops was near the Virginia Capes by March 10th is uncertain. She might have been further south still. If she was ahead of schedule, or drifted north faster than expected, it's conceivable she encountered that storm. The storm reportedly had winds of 30 to 40 knots and churned up very heavy seas. Such conditions could indeed spell doom for an overloaded, structurally stressed ship on one engine. Even if Cyclops wasn't in that exact storm, rogue waves or squalls can occur at any time on the open ocean without leaving a trace in historical weather logs. A large wave impact, combined with an already weakened hull, could have caused a fracture or capsizing in moments. Admiral Van Deur described a scenario where waves spaced just far enough apart could leave Cyclops' bow and stern supported on wave crests with her midsection hanging, causing the midsection to snap downward under its own weight. For a ship already sagging from cargo, that could be the breaking point. No time for SOS. Proponents of this theory note that if Cyclops broke apart or capsized suddenly, especially at night, the crew would have had virtually no warning. Perhaps a sudden loud crack in the middle of the night, and within a minute or two, the ship could split and flood. Many of the crew would be asleep in their bunks and could be trapped immediately. Even those on watch might have been thrown into the sea before reaching a wireless set or lifeboat. Nereus speculated that disasters likely struck at night when 90% of the crew was off duty and below decks, which is why no one got to lifeboats. Indeed, not a single lifeboat from Cyclops was ever found, suggesting none were launched. A rapid capsizing or breakup is one of the few scenarios that fit that detail. Deep water and no wreckage. The Atlantic Ocean in the vicinity of Cyclops' route includes some very deep areas, especially if the ship strayed slightly east of the direct route. One of the deepest part is Puerto Rico Trench, which reaches depths of over 8,000 meters or 26,000 feet. Researcher Marvin Barish, who has studied the case extensively, suspects Cyclops may have gone down near this trench or in similarly deep water. If so, any wreckage would plunge straight into a lightless abyss, not likely to flow back up. Even wooden pieces could become waterlogged and sink. Barish envisions a chain of events, mechanical failures, like that one engine out, plus an inexperienced crew handling a new heavy cargo, culminating in a critical moment, perhaps a giant wave or series of waves that cause the ship to roll and plunge under, passing over the Puerto Rico Trench and coming to rest in nearly unrecoverable depths. Modern experts also mention that manganese ore itself would have a magnetic signature, potentially detectable by magnetometers if one were searching the seafloor. But given the expansive ocean, finding the wreck is a needle in a haystack problem, without a more precise idea of where she went down. In summary, the structural failure theory does not rely on any enemy action or human malfeasance. It is essentially a perfect storm of physics and negligence. The ship was overburdened and possibly weakened. Nature provided just enough roughness, maybe not even a full storm, just heavy seas. The cargo shifted or the hull gave way, and Cyclops went to the bottom in one piece or split in two, taking everyone with her in an instant. The fact that two of Cyclops' sister ships, Proteus and Nereus, will later vanish under very similar circumstances, carrying very heavy ore cargoes in the North Atlantic in 1941, strongly supports this explanation. Those ships were no longer in Navy service, but their disappearances without a trace echoed Cyclops' fate and were attributed to structural failures as well. It appears that this class of ship had an Achilles heel when overloaded with dense cargo, a vulnerability that only became tragically clear in hindsight. We discussed the fate of these two sister ships here. USS Proteus was the lead ship of her class, despite Cyclops being commissioned earlier, and was launched in 1912. Commissioned into the U.S. Navy in July 1913, Proteus spent World War I performing the unglamorous but vital work of a collier. She steamed from Norfolk to the Caribbean and even as far as the Pacific, hauling coal, oil, men, and stores to U.S. bases in Allied ports. After the war, Proteus continued replenishment cruises to support the fleet, ranging from the Caribbean to as far as Pearl Harbor in Peru in the early 1920s. By 1924, with the Navy shifting to oil-fueled ships, Proteus was retired and decommissioned at Norfolk. She remained mothballed for nearly 2 decades until the eve of World War II. In March 1941, Proteus was brought back to life in a new guise, stricken from the Navy Register and sold to Saguenay Terminals Limited of Montreal, Canada. She was redesignated as a civilian SS Proteus. Saguenay Terminals was the shipping arm of the Aluminum Company of Canada. In the venerable Collier's new mission was to carry bauxite ore, the raw material for aluminum, from the Caribbean to North America's smelters. Under the command of Captain Walter Henry Miller, Proteus joined the Canadian Merchant Navy in 1941, painted in civilian colors and crewed by approximately 58 officers and men. Despite her age, the big ship's capacity made her valuable for feeding the Allied aluminum production critical for aircraft manufacture. Proteus's final voyage began from the same harbor that had been one of Cyclops' last ports of call, St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands. On the 23rd of November, 1941, the ship departed St. Thomas fully loaded with bauxite and set course for Portland, Maine, which was to serve as the offloading point for the ore. Normally, such a trip of roughly 1,600 to 1,800 nautical miles would take a ship of her type around 8 to 10 days of steaming. At the time Proteus cast off, the United States was not yet officially at war, though tensions in the Atlantic were high. She sailed independently, not in convoy, as was typical for Caribbean to North America routes in late 1941. Tragically, Proteus never arrived in Portland. The last confirmed communication, or sighting of her, was on the day she sailed, November 23rd. Sometime in the day that followed, the ship vanished into the sea without sending a distress call. It is believed that on or about 25th of November 1941, Proteus encountered severe weather. Reports suggest she may have run into heavy seas following a storm in the region. In all likelihood, the aging Collier, weighted down by thousands of tons of ore, foundered in those heavy seas on the 25th of November 1941 in the Caribbean. No lifeboats, wreckage, or survivors were ever found. All 58 crew members perished, their names later memorialized on the Halifax Memorial in Nova Scotia. At the time, Proteus's disappearance received little publicity. Events overtook it as the world was plunged into total war days later. But within the Admiralty and Allied shipping circles, alarm bells rang. The loss was abrupt and unexplained. Proteus had simply gone missing in fair company, much like Cyclops before her. Before investigators could even grapple with that puzzle, a second chapter was unfolding with terrifying similarities just weeks later. USS Nereus, another of the Proteus-class sisters, shared a nearly identical early career. Commissioned in late 1913, Nereus served the U.S. Atlantic Fleet through World War I, performing coal transport duties across the Atlantic and to distant Pacific ports. She was decommissioned in 1922 and laid up at Norfolk Navy Yard. Like her sister, Nereus was struck from the Navy list on the 5th of December 1940 and subsequently sold on the 27th of February 1941 to the Aluminum Company of Canada. Under this ownership, she operated out of Montreal alongside Proteus, carrying bauxite from Caribbean mines to aluminum plants in the United States and Canada. Captain John Thomas Bennett of the Canadian Merchant Navy took command, and about 61 souls comprised her crew and any essential personnel on board. In early December 1941, Nereus was following the same routine that Proteus had attempted. She loaded a full cargo of bauxite at St. Thomas, and on 10th of December 1941, less than 3 weeks after Proteus, Nereus departed St. Thomas, bound for Portland, Maine, via roughly the same northward route through the Caribbean into the Atlantic. Notably, this course would take Nereus along the very waters where Cyclops had disappeared in 1918. The timing, however, was now 4 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The United States had entered World War II, and German U-boats were a newly dire threat along Allied shipping lanes. One can imagine heightened nerves aboard Nereus as she steamed north into a suddenly active war zone. As fate would have it, Nereus never made it to her destination either. She too vanished without a trace, sometimes after the 10th of December 1941. The ship's last known position was simply her point of departure at St. Thomas. No radio messages were received during her voyage, and when Nereus failed to arrive in Portland by late December, it was clear something had gone horribly wrong. All 61 officers and crew aboard were lost, and like Proteus, the Nereus left behind no survivors or floating debris to tell the tale. It was as if the sea had swallowed her whole. What makes Nereus's disappearance especially chilling was the déjà vu it evoked. Here was another big Proteus-class collier, loaded with ore, lost on the same general route as Cyclops in only 1 month after her sister Proteus had gone missing. The incredible coincidence of these twin losses did not go unnoticed. Allied authorities quietly acknowledged the parallel. A December 1941 Canadian naval report recorded Nereus as missing presumed lost. In the Royal Navy Admiralty, grasping for explanations, even suspected sabotage initially, given the back-to-back disappearances of these two sister ships under similar circumstances. Families of the crew received condolence letters from King George VI, a sober recognition that Nereus, like Proteus, was considered a war casualty even though the exact cause was unknown. Both Proteus and Nereus were lost in the broad expanse of the western Atlantic, near the Caribbean Sea, an area later popularized as part of the so-called Bermuda Triangle. While the triangle notion veers into the speculative, it is true that these waters can be perilous. Late November and December are not part of the official hurricane season, but the North Atlantic can still produce fierce winter storms and heavy seas. In Proteus's case, evidence points to her encountering rough weather around the 25th of November 1941, shortly after leaving the Virgin Islands. A strong gale or residual tropical disturbance could have churned up large swells. An aging ship with structural weaknesses, which we will explore later, might have been unable to withstand such pounding. Nereus sailed into a region that was not only subject to natural hazards, but by December 1941, also teeming with wartime dangers. German U-boats had begun venturing into western Atlantic waters by that time, and though full-scale U-boats operations off the U.S. East Coast, Operation Drumbeat, would kick off in January 1942. Even in December, there was reason for concerns. Allied ships were starting to travel blacked out and zigzagging at night to evade submarines. However, neither Proteus nor Nereus sent an SOS or any report of being under attack, which ships under the U-boat assault often did if they had even a few minutes' warning. Their vanishings were sudden and silent. One particularly treacherous aspect of this region is the ocean topography. Much of the area north of the Virgin Islands lies over deep ocean trenches, which we've talked about, the Puerto Rico Trench just north of the Caribbean, and it plummets over 27,000 feet deep. A ship that foundered in such depths will leave little evidence on the surface, and any wreckage will be virtually impossible to locate without specialized deep-sea submersibles. Unlike coastal wrecks, which might later wash ashore debris or be found by divers, a ship lost in the deep open Atlantic in 1941 stood almost no chance of being found. This could explain why no debris field or wreck was ever sighted for either Proteus or Nereus. If they broke apart or capsized, their heavy ore cargo would have pulled them quickly to the abyss, leaving perhaps only splintered wood or a stray lifeboat, and none were reported in the busy shipping lanes. It's also worth noting the navigational hazards specific to the region. Bermuda, roughly in the path from the Caribbean to the U.S. East Coast, is surrounded by reef structures that have wrecked many ships over centuries. However, those reefs are mainly a danger to ships that stray near the island. Both Proteus and Nereus, like Cyclops, would likely have been taking a more direct route northwestward towards the U.S. mainland, possibly passing near Bermuda's longitude, but not necessarily close to land. Thus, while the Bermuda Triangle label has been attached to these incidents, the more tangible threats were rough seas and war-related perils rather than any supernatural cause. When Cyclops disappeared in 1918, the U.S. Navy undertook an exhaustive search. Numerous Navy and Allied vessels combed the shipping lanes from Barbados to Baltimore in the weeks after her last sighting. Despite this 90-day search mission, one of the most extensive in Navy history up to that point, no trace of Cyclops or her 300 crew was found. By mid-June 1918, the Navy officially declared the crew lost at sea. The possibility of a German submarine sinking had prompted immediate action, but the lack of debris and the lack of information of no U-boat activity in the area left the searchers baffled. The absence of any distress call from Cyclops was noted with bewilderment. It was as if whatever befell her was so sudden that the radios went silent instantly. In the late 1941, the world was at war, and the disappearances of Proteus and Nereus, unfortunately, did not prompt the same kind of publicized search armadas, in part because the entry of the U.S. into World War II overshadowed everything else. When Proteus failed to arrive in Portland by early December 1941, initial attempts would have been made to raise her by wireless. Naval stations and other ships along the route likely called for Proteus on emergency frequencies, but no reply came. The incident was handled by the Royal Navy and Canadian authorities, since Proteus was under Canadian registry by then. British Admiralty records indicate that saboteurs were briefly suspected, meaning there was concern that an enemy agent might have caused Proteus's loss, especially once Nereus went missing under the same circumstances. This suggests that Allied commanders did not consider it a simple navigational casualty. They feared foul play or enemy action. After Nereus also vanished in December, any remaining doubt that these were coincidences evaporated. Still, the war was now raging, and resources for a dedicated search were limited. It appears there was no large coordinated search mounted for these two merchant colliers beyond standard notices to vessels in the area to keep a lookout. Allied naval patrol aircraft, which by early 1942 began monitoring the East Coast and Caribbean for U-boats. It might have doubled as searchers for wreckage, but nothing was ever spotted. The losses were officially recorded, and both ships were listed among war-related merchant shipping losses, albeit with cause unknown. In essence, the search and rescue efforts for Proteus and Nereus was largely an armchair and administrative one, scouring intelligence for U-boat clues, interrogating any potential witnesses from ports of departure, and analyzing last known weather reports, but no survivor interviews or wreck inspections were possible. The families of the crew had to wait in anguish. Only in April 1942 did the U.S. Navy, by then fully collaborating with the British Canadian side, publicly acknowledge the ships were overdue and presumed loss, as earlier news was suppressed to avoid alarm or giving comfort to enemy. For the relatives, there was no closure, just names etched onto memorials. The onset of the Battle of the Atlantic meant that the Allies had many ships to mourn, and sadly, Proteus and Nereus became two more names on the long list of missing presumed sunk vessels. The uncanny link between Cyclops, Proteus, and Nereus is not just that they disappeared, it's that they were near identical ships. All three were Proteus-class colliers, sharing the same basic design, dimensions, and purpose. These ships had steel hulls over 500 feet long with minimal keel, optimized for carrying bulk cargo. Each had twin screws for propulsion. In Navy service, Cyclops made about 15 knots with her two engines, and broad beam for stability when carrying lighter coal. The cargo arrangement featured 6 large holds that could be loaded through the wide hatches on the main deck. Overhead, the lattice of goalpost masts and booms allowed them to refuel other ships by literally lifting coal in coal baskets. But this design, as time would tell, had its weaknesses. One issue was the weight distribution and hull strength. When these colliers carried coal, the material, though heavy, had a lot of airspace and did not exert as extreme a weight in a compact area as metal ore does. However, when Cyclops loaded nearly 11,000 tons of dense manganese ore in 1918, a cargo far heavier per cubic foot than coal, some have argued she was effectively overloaded or improperly ballasted, putting tremendous stress on her hull. Navy investigators at the time noted that if the ore cargo shifted in a storm, it could capsize or even break a ship. In fact, Cyclops was observed to have an extreme rolling tendency, possibly due to cargo shifting or design, which we talked about earlier. The Navy later acknowledged the ship had a documented problem with extreme side-to-side tipping, lending credence to the idea that she might have suddenly rolled over in rough seas. By the time Proteus and Nereus sailed in 1941, they were nearly 30-year-old hulls. Rear Admiral George Van Deur, USN retired, later conducted research into these losses and highlighted a critical factor: the corrosive effect of coal on the ship's structural members. Coal cargo can create acidic conditions, coal dust mixed with moisture, that over years severely erodes a ship's longitudinal support beams. Van Deur's suggested that Proteus and Nereus were aging and poorly constructed by modern standard, and that their hulls may have been fatally weakened by decades of coal dust corrosion and perhaps inadequate maintenance during their long layups. When these compromised ships then carried heavy loads of bauxite ore and encountered a storm, they may have broken apart or suffered hull failure. In essence, a ship's backbone could snap, if the seas hit a resonance with an already stressed hull. An eyewitness account from port observers in St. Thomas noted that Proteus's holds looks nearly full to the brim with bauxite before departure, indicating she was heavily laden. Bauxite is lighter than Cyclops manganese ore, but still a heavy metallic ore. Filling the holds would push the ship close to her weight limits. All three lost colliers also shared another design quirk. As colliers, they were not originally outfitted with robust subdivision or extensive pumping capacity like a warship. A single catastrophic breach, say a hull crack that flooded multiple holds, could sink them quickly. There is speculation that Cyclops might have suffered a structural failure amidship. Some point to a possible crack in her midsection, perhaps at a plate seam or around an old repair, which would cause rapid floundering. The same could apply to Proteus and Nereus. If one of those ships broke its back in heavy seas, it could go down in minutes, explaining the lack of any SOS. Another similarity was the lack of advanced communications or modern navigation aids by today's standards. In 1918, Cyclops only had Morse code wireless. By 1941, Proteus and Nereus might have had voice radio, but coverage was spotty in the mid-ocean. No satellites or long-range aircraft were watching. If disaster struck out of radio range of land, which it likely did, the crew were essentially on their own. In summary, the design and age of the Proteus-class ships likely made them prone to structural stress, especially when loaded with heavy ore instead of the coal they were built to carry. The trio's fate suggests a grim possibility that a flaw or limitation inherent to their construction contributed directly to their loss when combined with bad weather or other triggers. The fate of Proteus and Nereus is inextricably linked to that of Cyclops. It is a striking historical footnote that 3 out of 4 of the Proteus-class colliers simply vanished during peacetime voyages. The only sister ship to survive a normal lifespan was USS Jupiter, which had been converted into the Navy's first aircraft carrier, USS Langley, and even Langley was eventually sunk by Japanese attack in 1942. It's almost as if a dark curse hung over these colliers, leading some writers to dub it the Proteus-class curse. Of course, in reality, each loss had its own context, but the similarities are hard to ignore. All 3 disappeared without distress calls, suggesting whatever happened was rapid and catastrophic. All 3 were carrying heavy loads of ore instead of their designed cargo of coal. Each was lost in roughly the same region of the West Atlantic, within or near the bounds of Bermuda Triangle. No wreckage of any of the 3 has ever been conclusively found, despite the passage of over a century since Cyclops and more than 80 years since the 1941 losses. The U.S. Navy and Coast Guard have periodically revisited the Cyclops case, sometimes using it as a cautionary tale about the unpredictable power of the sea. In recent decade, advances in deep-sea exploration have raised hopes that Cyclops or her sisters might one day be found, similar to how Titanic was discovered. But given the vast search areas and no precise last positions, these wrecks remain elusive. Naval historians mark the Cyclops-Proteus-Nereus saga as a lesson in how even safe, non-combat mission can end in disaster. The loss of Cyclops was the Navy's greatest loss of life outside combat, and the twin losses of Proteus and Nereus added to the toll of the Battle of the Atlantic in a way that is often overlooked due to their mysterious nature. While the structural weather theory is not as sensational as enemy attack or supernatural triangles, it is backed by a lot of circumstantial evidence and expert opinion. In the absence of any contrary proof, many naval historians consider it the most plausible cause of Cyclops' loss. Modern bulk carrier ships have suffered similar sudden sinkings when cargoes shifted or hulls cracked, so this scenario is far from far-fetched. However, because no wrecks has been found, it remains an educated hypothesis. Theory 2. Enemy attack. In 1918, with World War I in full swing, one of the first suspicion about Cyclops' fate was that she might have been a casualty of enemy action. Could the Cyclops have been sunk by a German U-boat or a commerce raider lurking in the West Atlantic? This theory gained traction initially because it was wartime, and the idea of a German threat on the high seas was very real for Allied public. To consider this theory, let's recall Cyclops' situation. In March 1918, unrestricted submarine warfare by Germany was at its peak in the Atlantic. German U-boats had been sinking Allied ships, mostly in European waters, but occasionally off North America, in significant numbers since 1917. However, the Caribbean and mid-Atlantic west of Bermuda were not common areas of U-boat operations, at least not in early 1918. No German surface raiders, such as armed merchant cruisers, were known to be active near the U.S. at that time either. The German Navy's few far-ranging surface raiders like SMS Siedler had been neutralized by 1917, and by 1918, the German high seas fleet was mostly blockaded in home waters. Still, one cannot completely rule out a lone submarine patrol. At the time Cyclops disappeared, people did wonder if she was the victim of a German submarine or raider. The Cyclops would indeed have made a juicy target for the enemy. She was huge, slow-moving, and carrying vital war cargo. If a U-boat captain had spotted Cyclops, he would likely have seen a very tempting opportunity to deal a blow to the Americans. A single torpedo or a few shell hits from the deck gun could have been enough to sink the unarmed collier. Crucially, a sudden torpedo strike might also explain the lack of a distress call. If Cyclops was struck by a torpedo in a critical spot, she could have flooded rapidly. However, no concrete evidence has ever emerged to support the enemy attack theory. After the war, German records were thoroughly examined by the US and Britain. The German Imperial Navy denied any knowledge of Cyclops' fate. No German submarine log or command report mentions engaging or sighting a ship that could have been Cyclops during that time frame. It is worth noting that the U-boat captains generally took pride in their sinkings and would claim credit, especially for a warship of that size. For example, when German subs sank the passenger liner Lusitania in 1915 or attacked U.S. transports later in the war, those were documented. If Cyclops had been torpedoed, it would have been one of the largest single kills by a U-boat, surely notable enough to record. But the German archives are silent on Cyclops. Additionally, in March 1918, the presence of German submarines in the western Atlantic was still sparse. The main U-boat offensives on the American coast began a bit later, around May to June 1918, when U-boats like the U-151 ventured into U.S. waters and sank several merchant ships off the East Coast. In early March, the known U-boats were focused around European waters or the Eastern Atlantic. The idea of a stealth German surface raider capturing Cyclops also doesn't hold much water. Any raider would have had to sink her or take her as a prize, and there's no trace of either. And if by slim chance some German ship had captured Cyclops, They would have had to deal with over 300 prisoners. And then what? Sail the Collier to a remote port? No such scenario occurred to anyone's knowledge. And one more point. An enemy attack doesn't account well for the total lack of debris. Typically, if torpedoed, some debris like life jackets, plank, oil might later be found, unless the ship sank in a very calm sea that allowed everything to go down. However, if Cyclops was hit and went to the bottom intact, most floating debris could have been minimal or dispersed. It's not impossible for torpedoed ships to vanish without a trace, especially if heavily laden, but it is less likely. There were rumors in 1918 that perhaps Cyclops had been captured rather than sunk, possibly in a German plot. One false report even suggested Cyclops had been taken to a secret German base. But again, post-war intelligence found no indication of such an audacious operation. Germany had no secret island bases in the Americas and certainly couldn't hide a 500-plus-foot ship for long. The U.S. Navy, while initially not dismissing the possibility of a U-boat attack, grew skeptical as evidence failed to appear. A month after the disappearance, Navy officials publicly stated they did not believe a submarine was responsible. The New York Times at the time entertained the theory, but noted it wasn't supported by Navy thinking. The Navy pointed out that Germany had nothing to gain by hiding such a victory. They would use it for propaganda if true. Indeed, Germany openly celebrated, or at least acknowledged, sinking much smaller Allied ships. Remaining mum about Cyclops would be uncharacteristic. While Cyclops' disappearance happened in wartime and enemy action was a logical suspicion, all available evidence, or lack thereof, indicates it was not due to a German attack. Modern investigators concur that it's not likely that Germany would try to cover up the sinking of a U.S. Navy ship, especially since they admitted to other controversial sinkings like that of the Lusitania. The overwhelming silence from German records and the pattern of U-boat operations make this theory largely untenable. Theory 3. Sabotage, mutiny, or treachery from within. Another set of theories revolves around the idea that the cause of Cyclops' loss might not have been external at all, but rather internal, involving intentional acts by those on board. These speculations were fueled by the peculiar background of Captain Worley in the presence of Consul Gottschalk, as well as reports of discord on the ship. There are a few variations of this idea. A. German saboteurs or handing the ship over to the enemy. One rumor held that Lieutenant Commander Worley, being German-born and allegedly pro-German, might have betrayed his ship. Perhaps, as some suggested, he arranged to secretly rendezvous with a German submarine or raider and handed Cyclops over, either by surrender or by defecting himself. This theory imagines a cloak and dagger scenario. Worley, and possibly a clique of German sympathizing crew members, seize control of Cyclops, perhaps by neutralizing those who would resist, and then navigate the ship to meet the enemy. Gottschalk's presence in this scenario is sometimes painted as part of the plot. Though he was an American official, the conspiracy-minded thought he might have been a German agent at heart. Once in the hands of enemies, Cyclops could have been either taken to a German port or scuttled after transferring cargo. It's a dramatic story, but there's zero evidence to support it. Naval intelligence did investigate Worley's loyalty thoroughly after the fact. They verified his German birth and his personality issues, but nothing indicated he had any contact with German agents. The fact that so many crew had Germanic names, per Livingston's observation, is no proof of disloyalty. America in 1918 had many first or second generation immigrants from Germany who served faithfully in the armed forces. Notably, if such a handover had occurred, the Germans, again, left no record. One would expect that a 19,000-ton prize ship showing up in Germany or being met at sea would have left some trace in German naval communication. None was ever found. Germany also didn't suddenly get a cache of manganese ore from anywhere. And both Worley and Gottschalk vanished along with everyone else. Had they been conspirators, they did not reappear after the war in any detectable way. Gottschalk's fate, we know, he was officially listed as dead on Cyclops. If he had been in cahoots with Germany, one might expect him to quietly resurface later under a different identity, but nothing of the kind happened. B. Sabotage or mutiny leading to disaster. Another internal scenario is that disaffected crew members or spies on board sabotage the ship's engine or structure, causing her to sink. During World War I, there were instances of German agents attempting sabotage in factories and ships. For example, the Black Tom explosion in New York Harbor 1916 was caused by saboteurs. Could Cyclops have had a planted bomb or deliberate scuttling? Alternatively, perhaps a mutiny broke out due to the crew's hatred of Worley, resulting in chaos that led to the ship's doom. The Barbados consul's telegram reference to a possible execution hints at some serious discipline issue. One could imagine a scenario. A group of crewmen try to take control of the ship, maybe to vent anger at Worley or to desert. A fight ensues, and in the struggle, something catastrophic happens. Say the ship is steered improperly into a storm, or a valve is accidentally opened, flooding the ship. Again, there's no hard evidence for sabotage or mutiny culminating in loss. If a bomb or deliberate explosion sank Cyclops, it was never detected by any nearby ship. If a mutiny occurred, it would have to be incredibly swift and all-consuming, such that not a single person managed to survive or signal. Moreover, any mutineers would presumably not want to kill themselves, yet all hands perished. The absence of survivors leans towards a sudden natural or structural cause, rather than the protracted conflict on board. However, the mutiny idea is not entirely far-fetched, in that minor insubordination did occur. There were reports of minor mutiny on board a few months earlier, which the Navy resolved, so morale was low. One could speculate that in the stressful conditions of the final voyage, overloaded ship, failing engine, oppressive captain, perhaps something snapped among the crew. If, for instance, some crew member attempted to alter course, say run the ship to an island or neutral port to escape Worley's command, a struggle on the bridge might have led to navigational errors or neglect of duties, which in a storm could prove fatal. This is admittedly very speculative. All told, the consensus among historians is that while the personalities involved make for interesting intrigue, there is no solid indication of foul play from within. The Navy, after the war, explicitly looked for evidence of Worley's alleged collaboration or any such plot and found nothing in German records. Furthermore, as a logical matter, even if one assumed Worley wanted to give his ship to Germany, how would he do it? There were no German forces in the Western Atlantic to receive it by March 1918. U-boats didn't have the capacity to take a ship that size anywhere, and no rendezvous was arranged. Thus, the sabotage treason theory largely falls into the category of unproven rumor, fueled by wartime anti-German paranoia and the admittedly strained profile of the captain. Theory 4. The Bermuda Triangle and other supernatural explanations. No discussion of Cyclops' fate would be complete without touching on the more colorful theories, those that venture beyond conventional science and into the realm of legend. The Cyclops is often listed as one of the earliest and largest victims of what popular culture later dubbed the Bermuda Triangle. The Bermuda Triangle refers to a triangular area in the western North Atlantic, with vertices roughly at Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, notoriously in lore for unexplained disappearances of ships and aircraft. While the Cyclops incident predates the fame of the term, which emerged around the 1950s, later writers eagerly retrofitted it into the triangle mythos. Under the Bermuda Triangle theory, it suggested that Cyclops might have been enveloped by some mysterious force or phenomenon unique to that region. Over the years, triangle enthusiasts have offered ideas ranging from unusual electromagnetic anomalies that disrupt navigation to time warps to methane gas blowouts from the seafloor that could supposedly sink ships. In the case of Cyclops, a variety of supernatural or speculative causes have been bandied about. Giant sea monster. The Santa Fe magazine quote about a gigantic monster of the sea grabbing Cyclops reflects a semi-humorous invocation of the sea serpent or giant squid idea. It's essentially metaphorical. No serious person suggested a kraken dragged down a 19,000-ton ship. However, in the imaginative retellings, one hears references to perhaps a giant octopus entangled her, or other such fantastical fates. We can safely say there is no evidence a creature was responsible. Giant squids exist, but they do not attack whole ships. The lost city of Atlantis. Some triangle lore links the area to mythical sunken city of Atlantis and posits maybe Atlantean energies or crystal powers caused ships to vanish. This is purely in the realm of fiction or fringe pseudoscience. There's no historical or scientific backing for it, but it gets mentioned in sensational accounts. UFOs or alien abduction. One idea is that Cyclops was taken by extraterrestrials, that a UFO came down and lifted the ship, or that aliens abducted the crew. This belongs more to science fiction than serious inquiry, though such notions occasionally surfaced when no mundane explanation seemed satisfying to some. Magnetic anomaly or electronic fog. One slightly less wild suggestion is that Cyclops might have encountered some rare environmental phenomenon, like an electronic fog or magnetic field disturbance that incapacitated it. The Bermuda Triangle is sometimes said to be a place where compasses spin and instruments fail. If Cyclops lost navigation or propulsion due to some unknown magnetic anomaly, perhaps she could have wandered off course and into peril. However, none of the known physics of the area goes beyond what could be explained by human error or known weather. The Bermuda Triangle mystery has been largely debunked by experts as a mix of exaggeration and misinterpretation of normal maritime dangers. The U.S. Coast Guard and Navy do not recognize the triangle as a hazard distinct from the rest of the ocean. Many so-called triangle disappearances have prosaic explanations or weren't even in that geographic triangle. In Cyclops' case, her route from Barbados to Baltimore would have taken her through the heart of what some define as the Bermuda Triangle area, the coincidence that her two sister ships also vanished in that general region in later years is often cited to dramatize the curse of the triangle. It is a striking coincidence, to be fair, and no other class of ship has three large vessels vanish without a trace. But as we have discussed, there are very plausible physical reasons involving the ship's design and the cargo that linked to those incidents, without invoking the paranormal. Still, the image of a calm sea swallowing a massive ship without a cry does evoke something eerie. The crew of Cyclops had reported fair weather, all well, at last contact, which lends to the spooky notion that in calm conditions, something incredible must have happened. Triangle lore loves this kind of scenario, sudden, unexplained vanishings in good weather. It's possible, of course, that the weather took a sudden bad turn after that last message, so one mustn't jump to mystic portals when stealth storm or rogue waves would do. In any case, more imaginative theories like aliens, Atlantis, or supernatural forces remain in the realm of fringe speculation. They speak more to the human fascination with mysteries than to evidence. The Navy has never given any credence to such ideas, but they often creep into retelling of the Cyclops story, because people are drawn to the uncanny. It does no harm to acknowledge them, but after listing them, we must also note that there's no factual support for any of these extraordinary claims. The simplest explanation usually suffices. Nature, not the supernatural, likely claimed Cyclops. Considering all the above, the consensus scenario focused on natural and technical causes. Modern investigators who have studied Cyclops lean towards a combination of factors: an overstressed ship carrying an unfamiliar dense cargo, possibly encountering rough seas, leading to a rapid sinking. The fact that no wreckage was found could be because she went down so fast and in such deep waters that little escaped. The human elements, the captain's temperament, the crew's unrest, may have indirectly contributed. For example, poor leadership leading to poor loading or not heeding warning signs. But they likely were not the direct cause. Enemy action, while initially plausible, has been effectively ruled out by historical records. And the wild paranormal ideas, while entertaining, are not considered seriously by those who have spent time researching the case. In the end, the disappearance of Cyclops can be seen as a tragic convergence of human error and natural hazard. The ship might have endured had she not been overburdened, or had her engine been fully operational, or had she not run into heavy sea, or had her captain been a bit more cautious in loading. Remove one or two of those factors, and perhaps Cyclops would have made it to port, slightly battered, but safe. Instead, all factors lined up in the worst way, and she just kind of fell off the face of the earth, to quote Marvin Barish. With her went not only 300 lives, but a tantalizing mystery that still prompts us to wonder and hypothesize. Chapter 6: Legacy of the Cyclops. In the wake of the Cyclops disaster, the U.S. Navy and the public were left with not only grief, but also a cautionary tale. For the Navy, the loss underscored the importance of ship design and cargo handling in preventing tragedies. Though no official blame was ever pinned on any one factor, internally, the Navy did take heed of the theories. Subsequent bulk cargo operations were done more carefully, and the vulnerabilities of older colliers were noted. In fact, the vanishing of Cyclops' sister ships Proteus and Nereus in 1941 drove home that ships of that design could fail under heavy loads. It is likely not a coincidence that modern bulk carriers are engineered with stringent loading guidelines to avoid structural stress and have improved communications for distress signaling. The ghost of Cyclops lurks behind some of those safety rules. The Cyclops remains to this day the largest U.S. Navy vessel ever lost without a trace. It also stands as the Navy's greatest loss of life in a non-combat incident. This grim distinction means Cyclops is remembered in Navy annals with a mix of sadness and perplexity. The annual Secretary of the Navy reports in naval history texts include the Cyclops alongside names like the USS Maine or USS Arizona, ships whose destruction had clear causes and enemy involvement. Except Cyclops stands out because we don't know exactly what happened. She's an unresolved chapter. In popular culture and collective memory, Cyclops has been woven into the fabric of Bermuda Triangle legend and other mystery lore. Countless books, articles, and TV documentaries about the Triangle mention the Cyclops as one of the classic cases of inexplicable maritime loss. The ship has even made its way into fiction. One pulp story in the 1940s imagined a scenario for her disappearance, and more recently, she might be referenced in video games or novels that play on real mysteries. The aura of the unknown gives Cyclops a kind of mythic status akin to the Mary Celeste or the Flying Dutchman. If one visits naval museums or maritime exhibits, Cyclops sometimes appear as a footnote in displays about the Bermuda Triangle or unsolved sea mysteries. The Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia, holds a poignant artifact related to Cyclops, a spare part box that once belonged to the ship. This trunk was inadvertently left behind in Norfolk. The captain or crew offloaded it before the final voyage, perhaps expecting to retrieve it later. It sat forgotten in a house's crawl space until found in 1926 and eventually donated to the museum in 1941. Today, it serves as a tangible reminder of Cyclops. Seeing that box, an ordinary object from an extraordinary story, one can't help but feel a connection to the people of Cyclops. It's as if the ship left a small piece of itself on land, even as the rest lies somewhere out in the vast ocean. The box is displayed occasionally, a silent witness to the tragedy, its emptiness symbolizing the void left by the ship's disappearance. In Baltimore, the intended destination Cyclops never reached, families waited on the pier in vain. Some of those families later contributed to memorial plaques or entries in hometown honor rolls for the war dead. Although the men of Cyclops did not die in battle, they were war casualties in a broader sense, and their names are inscribed alongside others of the Great War generation. In recent decades, researchers like Marvin Barish, a descendant of a Cyclops crewman, have kept the memory alive. Barish painstakingly collected documents and even a piece of manganese ore, believed to be from Cyclops' cargo, recovered from a dock in Rio, blackened with age. His dedication to publishing books on Cyclops and lobbying for continued search efforts. "I just want her to be found," Barish said. "I want the 309 to be at rest as well as the families. It's something everybody needs, some resolution. This sentiment resonates with many. The idea that even after a century, finding the wreck of Cyclops would bring closure and perhaps final answers. Technology is gradually catching up to the challenge. Undersea exploration has advanced significantly, especially in the last 2 decades. Sunken warships thought lost forever have been located in very deep water. For example, the USS Indianapolis, sunk in 1945, was found at a depth of 18,000 feet in 2017. And even older wrecks, like a World War I U-boat in 2019 at 6,000 plus feet. As Barish and others point out, there are fewer and fewer lost shipwrecks every year, thanks to high-tech sonar, submersibles, and research initiatives. The Cyclops may well be within reach of a dedicated search. The challenge is the search area. Without knowing if she veered off course, the potential area is vast. But certain clues, currents where debris would have floated if any, could help narrow it. One day, perhaps an autonomous drone or a deep tow sonar might stumble across a colossal wreck on the seabed with the telltale shape of a collier's hull and the signature of a large metal ore cargo. If that day comes, we might finally see images of Cyclops' remains and confirm the cause. Even without that discovery, Cyclops has left a legacy in cautionary lessons. Bulk carriers today are very mindful of cargo distribution to avoid what happened to Cyclops. The story is sometimes cited in maritime safety courses when discussing the dangers of cargo liquefaction or overloading. In an interesting connection, the phenomenon of cargo shift causing rapid capsizing, a suspected theory in Cyclops' case, has caused modern tragedies too. For example, MV Derbyshire in 1980, a 1,000-foot ore carrier that sank in a typhoon, likely due to structural failure and flooding. The ocean is unforgiving of miscalculation, a truth Cyclops taught at great cost. On a cultural level, Cyclops reminds us of the limits of human knowledge. In an age where we tend to think we can explain everything, the fate of Cyclops remains a sobering reminder that the sea can still keep its secrets. For the families and descendants, the absence of a grave or a known site of rest can be a lingering source of melancholy. Memorials for Cyclops are essentially memorials to the unknown. As we conclude this deep exploration, picture the USS Cyclops once more. It's March 1918, and the great ship is plowing through gentle swells under a sunny sky. Her hull weighted down with ore, her single screw churning. The crew go about their routine. Perhaps some are singing quietly or thinking of home. While on the bridge, Captain Worley peers ahead from under his hat. Somewhere on the horizon, clouds begin to build, or fate begins to tighten its grips. In the vast expanse of the Atlantic, far from any shore, the Cyclops meets her destiny. Exactly how, we may not know for certain, but in that lonely place, at that moment, the story of Cyclops ends and the legend begins. The ship slips beneath the waves, leaving only questions rippling on the surface. To this day, The waters she traversed hold her story untold. We are left with fragments, a spare part box in a museum, a line in a diary, a name on a memorial, and a mystery echoing through time. As we finish our journey through the tale of USS Cyclops, we reflect on the fragility of even the mightiest ships against the power of nature and the unknown. It is a mystery that invites contemplation, one that might even lull us into a pensive, sleepy wonder at the world's vast uncertainties. May the souls lost with Cyclops rest in peace, and may we continue to remember and learn from this mystery of the sea. As the saying goes, only God and the sea know what happened on that fateful voyage. And until the sea gives up its secret, Cyclops will sail on in our imaginations, a ghostly giant of the deep.